There is a moment, somewhere deep beneath the surface of what is now central Turkey, when a hand reaches for a lamp that will not light again. Not because the wick is gone, not because the oil has run dry, but because the person holding it has made a calculation that no one alive today would understand. They are standing in a tunnel carved from soft volcanic rock, surrounded by the breathing dark, and they have decided that the light is no longer worth the air it consumes. Think about that choice for a moment. Not the choice to descend into darkness, not the choice to build these tunnels in the first place, but the choice to extinguish the last flame and trust that the darkness is safer than the alternative. This is not a story about Derinkuyu, the massive underground city discovered in 1963 beneath the Cappadocia region. At least, not in the way you might expect. Because when we talk about Derinkuyu, we usually focus on the wrong question. We ask, why would anyone build something like this? 18 stories deep. Ventilation shafts descending hundreds of feet. Stone doors that weigh half a ton, designed to seal from the inside. Space for 20,000 people, carved entirely by hand from compressed volcanic ash. We marvel at the engineering. We speculate about the threats. We imagine armies on the surface, catastrophes, invasions, the collapse of civilizations. But there is a smaller story inside this larger mystery. A story that lives in the moment when someone, perhaps a woman in her 30s, perhaps a man who has lived his entire life underground during certain seasons, stands in a chamber deep enough that no surface sound can reach, and makes the decision to blow out the candle. That moment contains everything we need to understand about what fear does to human consciousness. The air in these tunnels is not still. Even now, thousands of years after they were abandoned, the ventilation system still functions. Air moves through shafts so precisely engineered that they maintain breathable atmosphere in chambers 400 feet below the surface. The people who built this understood fluid dynamics in a way that would not be formally articulated in Western science for another 2,000 years. They understood pressure differentials. They understood that air, like water, flows from high to low, and that if you design the channels correctly, the earth itself will breathe for you. But here is what they also understood. Every flame consumes the very thing that keeps you alive. In a sealed environment, this is not a metaphor. It is mathematics. A single oil lamp, burning for 1 hour, consumes approximately the same amount of oxygen as a grown human resting for that same hour. Which means that in a tunnel network designed to hold 20,000 people, every light source is a negotiation with survival. Every flame is a small death for someone else. So when did this realization first occur? Not to the builders necessarily, but to the people who actually lived in these spaces. When did someone first understand that the comfort of seeing their child's face across the room had a cost that could be measured in breaths? We do not know their names. We do not know the exact year, though evidence suggests these tunnels were expanded and occupied repeatedly between the 8th century BCE and the 5th century CE, during periods when the surface world became temporarily uninhabitable for reasons that remain disputed. We do not know what language they spoke in those deep chambers, or what stories they told each other in the dark. But we know this. At some point, someone made the choice to teach their children to live without light. Not for minutes, not for hours, but for weeks, possibly months. There are chambers in Derinkuyu where no evidence of fire has ever been found. No soot on the ceilings. No residue on the floors. Rooms that were clearly inhabited, clearly used for living rather than storage, but which existed in a darkness so complete that the people inside them would have been functionally blind. And yet these chambers show signs of long-term occupation. Food preparation areas, sleeping spaces, places where children played, if playing is something that happens in absolute darkness. What does that do to a mind? Modern research into sensory deprivation tells us that the human brain, deprived of visual input, begins to generate its own. Hallucinations emerge within 48 hours in complete darkness. The visual cortex, desperate for stimulation, starts inventing things to see. Patterns, faces, movement where there is none. This is not a failure of perception. This is the brain refusing to accept that nothing is there. So imagine spending not days but weeks in this state. Imagine becoming so familiar with the hallucinations that you can distinguish between the phantoms your own mind creates and the actual sounds of other people moving in the darkness nearby. Imagine developing a relationship with your own neural misfiring. Learning to ignore the faces that appear in the black. Teaching your children to do the same. The lights are not real, you might whisper. Do not follow them. Because in true darkness, the brain becomes its own worst enemy, or its own best companion. The line between those two states is thinner than we would like to believe. There is a field of study called paleoanthropology that concerns itself with the deep history of human cognition. How did we become capable of abstract thought? When did language emerge? What evolutionary pressures shaped the particular kind of consciousness we now possess? And one of the most interesting findings in recent decades is this. The human brain is not optimized for truth. It is optimized for survival, which means that what we call reality is actually a very specific kind of hallucination. A controlled hallucination. Our brains receive electromagnetic signals through our optic nerves and translate them into a three-dimensional model of space. But this model is not objective. It is not accurate in any absolute sense. It is a simplified, edited, evolutionarily useful fiction that allows us to navigate the world without being paralyzed by the sheer volume of sensory data available at any given moment. We do not see what is there. We see what we need to see in order to survive. And in absolute darkness, this system breaks down in fascinating ways. The people who lived in Derinkuyu would have experienced this breakdown repeatedly. They would have learned to navigate it. They would have developed cultural knowledge about which hallucinations could be trusted and which should be ignored. They would have created oral traditions, passed from parent to child, about how to maintain sanity in an environment where the usual sensory anchors of human experience simply did not exist. And somewhere in this process, something strange would have happened to their sense of time. Because time, as we experience it, is not a physical property of the universe. It is a construction of consciousness. The brain creates the sensation of time passing by tracking changes in the environment. Light becomes dark. Sounds rise and fall. Temperature shifts. The body experiences hunger, then satiation, then hunger again. These changes are stitched together into a narrative we call the passage of time. But in a sealed chamber deep underground, where temperature remains constant, where there is no day or night, where meals are rationed and arrive at irregular intervals to conserve resources, where there is no visual change because there is no light to reveal change, time begins to dissolve. Studies of people isolated in caves without time cues show that the human circadian rhythm extends. Without the sunrise to reset it, the brain's internal clock drifts toward a 25 or even 26-hour cycle. Sleep and wake periods blur. The distinction between yesterday and today becomes less meaningful. People lose track of how long they have been underground. Days feel like hours. Hours feel like days. So when we ask how long the people of Derinkuyu stayed beneath the surface, we might be asking the wrong question. Because after a certain point they would have stopped counting. Time would have become something fluid. Something that pooled in the darkness like water in the cisterns, unmeasured and unmeasurable. And in that timeless space, consciousness itself would have shifted. There is a theory in cognitive science called the extended mind hypothesis, which suggests that the boundary between the mind and the environment is more porous than we typically assume. Tools become extensions of thought. Language shapes what we are capable of conceiving. The spaces we inhabit literally structure our consciousness. If this is true, then the tunnels of Derinkuyu were not just shelters. They were machines for producing a specific kind of human experience, a specific kind of awareness. Imagine a child born during one of these underground periods. Their first memories are not of sunlight, but of texture. The feel of carved rock under their fingers. The echo of footsteps in a tunnel. The smell of other bodies in an enclosed space. Their mother's voice, close in the dark. The taste of stale water from a cistern that has been sealed for weeks. This child's brain would wire itself differently than a child raised on the surface. The neural pathways dedicated to processing visual information would be repurposed. The hippocampus, which maps spatial relationships, would construct its model of the world based on sound and touch rather than sight. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and social interaction, would develop strategies for community cohesion in an environment where isolation is a constant threat. This child would grow into an adult whose consciousness is fundamentally different from ours. Not less sophisticated, not less fully human, but calibrated to a different reality. And when they finally emerged onto the surface, when whatever danger had driven them underground had passed, they would experience the open sky as a kind of violence. Too much space, too much light, too much visual information to process. The horizon itself would be painful. The sensation of wind on the face, overwhelming. The simple act of looking up at the stars, devastating. Because they would understand, in a way we cannot, how fragile the membrane is between survival and annihilation. How quickly the familiar world can become uninhabitable. How easily light can become a luxury you cannot afford. And they would carry this knowledge back down into the tunnels with them, preparing for the next time, improving the ventilation, expanding the storage chambers, teaching their own children the disciplines of darkness. This is the paradox of Derinkuyu. We look at it and see an engineering marvel, evidence of ancient ingenuity, proof that humans have always been capable of remarkable things when survival demands it. But the people who built it saw something else. They saw a tomb that they had to make livable, a prison they had to make bearable, a darkness they had to learn to love, because the alternative was death. And at the center of this paradox is that moment when the lamp goes out. That instant when someone chooses the dark. Because that choice is not made once. It is made over and over. Every time you descend. Every time you seal the stone door. Every time you whisper to your child that the lights in their head are not real. That choice is the entire history of human fear, compressed into a single gesture. We do not know what they were hiding from. The historical record is unclear. Some scholars believe the tunnels were refuges from raiding armies. The Hittites, the Phrygians, the Persians, all swept through this region at various points. Others suggest religious persecution. early Christian communities hiding from Roman authorities. Still others point to environmental disasters, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, extended droughts that made the surface world uninhabitable. But perhaps the specific threat does not matter as much as we think it does. Because what Derinkuyu really shows us is not what they were afraid of. It shows us what fear itself looks like when it becomes architecture, when it becomes culture, when it becomes a way of life passed down through generations. Fear, sustained long enough, becomes indistinguishable from wisdom. The same knowledge that tells you to build ventilation shafts 400 feet deep is the knowledge that tells you to extinguish the lamp. The same caution that makes you carve 18 stories into bedrock is the caution that makes you teach your children to hallucinate correctly. It is all the same survival instinct, expressed at different scales. And this raises a question that we have still not answered. What is the correct response to fear? When the danger is real, when the threat is imminent, when survival depends on immediate action, fear is adaptive. Focuses the mind, immobilizes the body. It makes possible things that would otherwise be impossible. But when the danger is chronic, when the threat is constant but uncertain, when survival depends not on a single action but on sustained vigilance over months or years or generations, fear becomes something else. It becomes a permanent state of consciousness, a baseline condition of existence. And in that state, the distinctions we normally rely on begin to collapse. Safety becomes indistinguishable from captivity. Protection becomes indistinguishable from isolation. Caution becomes indistinguishable from paralysis. The people of Derinkuyu lived in this collapsed state. They had to. The alternative was death. But they also found ways to remain human inside it. They created spaces for communal gathering even in the deepest levels. They built chapels for worship. They carved storage rooms for food and wine, because even in darkness, even in fear, people need more than mere survival. They need meaning. They need connection. They need something to live for beyond the simple fact of staying alive. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Derinkuyu. Not that it exists, but that it was inhabited in a way that preserved human dignity. There are marks on the walls. Graffiti essentially. Names carved in stone. Symbols whose meaning we no longer understand. Evidence that people, trapped underground, surrounded by darkness and uncertainty, still felt the need to say, "I was here. I existed. Mattered." This impulse is older than writing, older than civilization. It is one of the defining characteristics of human consciousness. The need to leave a mark, to be witnessed, to inscribe our presence onto the world in some way that outlasts the moment. And in the tunnels of Derinkuyu, this impulse takes on a particular poignancy. Because these marks were made in darkness, the person carving them could not see what they were creating. They worked by touch, by memory, by faith that the gesture itself had value even if no one would ever see the result. This is creation as an act of defiance against erasure, against the darkness that threatens to swallow everything, against the fear that tells you nothing matters, nothing lasts, nothing you do will make a difference. And in this sense, the graffiti on the walls of Derinkuyu is no different than the great works of art and literature and philosophy that humans have created throughout history. It is all the same impulse, the same refusal to accept oblivion quietly. We were here. We existed. We mattered. Even if we had to say it in the dark. There is a room in Derinkuyu, on the 7th level down, that appears to have been a school. The walls show signs of deliberate smoothing, creating surfaces that could be written on with chalk or charcoal. There are benches carved from the rock, a raised platform that might have been a teacher's desk, and along one wall, a series of small alcoves, each one perfectly sized for a child to sit in, sheltered and enclosed. Imagine teaching in this space. Imagine being responsible for the education of children who may never see the sun. What do you teach them? What knowledge is most important when the world has contracted to a series of tunnels and chambers? You would teach them to navigate by touch, to recognize the acoustic signature of different chambers, to conserve air and water and food, to remain calm in enclosed spaces, to trust the darkness. But you would also, if you were wise, teach them that the darkness is not permanent, that somewhere above, unreachable but real, the sun still rises, the wind still moves through grass, rivers still flow toward the sea. You would teach them to remember the surface world, even if they have never experienced it themselves. You would teach them to imagine it correctly, to hold in their minds the possibility of return. Because without this knowledge, without this hope, the tunnels become not a refuge but a grave. The darkness becomes not a temporary necessity but a permanent condition. And the human mind cannot survive that. Not intact, not sane. So the teachers in Derinkuyu were not just preserving academic knowledge. They were preserving the possibility of hope, the imagination of elsewhere, the faith that this darkness, however long it lasted, was not forever. This is a different kind of survival than we usually think about. Not the survival of the body, but the survival of the mind. The preservation of consciousness itself against an environment that threatens to extinguish it. And it required, we must assume, extraordinary discipline. Because children ask questions. They want explanations. They need to understand why. And in the darkness of Derinkuyu, there would have been questions that had no good answers. Why can we not go outside? When will we return? What did we do to deserve this? And what do you say? How do you explain to a child that the world they were born into is not the world as it should be? That this darkness is an aberration? That life, real life, exists somewhere above but is currently beyond reach? You cannot lie to them. Children know when adults are hiding the truth. They can hear it in the voice, feel it in the hesitation. But you also cannot give them the full weight of adult fear. Cannot explain that you do not know when this will end, or if it will end, or what will be left of the world when it does. So you find a middle path. You tell them stories. Stories about the surface world, about sunlight and rain and the seasons. Stories that function as a kind of cultural memory, preserving knowledge of a world that exists but cannot currently be accessed. And in telling these stories, you perform a small miracle. You make the invisible real. You make the inaccessible present. You give children who have never seen the sky a relationship with it nonetheless. This is what narrative does. This is its evolutionary function. It allows consciousness to transcend the immediate, to exist in multiple times and places simultaneously, to be here in this dark chamber, and also there, in the imagined sunlight of a story told by someone who remembers. And in this way, the people of Derinkuyu remained connected to the surface world even during the longest periods underground. They carried it with them, kept it alive in their minds, passed it from one generation to the next like a sacred flame that burns without consuming air. But there is something else happening in these stories. something we have not yet named. Because the stories told in darkness are not the same as the stories told in light. The narrative structures shift. The emphases change. What matters in the dark is not always what matters on the surface. Above ground, stories are often about action. Heroes who venture out. Journeys to distant places. Conflicts resolved through movement and change. But below ground, in the stillness and enclosure of Derinkuyu, stories would have taken a different shape. They would have been about endurance rather than action. About patience rather than conquest. About the quiet courage required to stay put, to wait, to trust that stillness is sometimes the correct response to danger. These would have been stories about interiority, about the landscape of the mind rather than the landscape of the earth, about the struggles that happen inside a person when the external world offers no options, no choices, no possibility of change. And in telling these stories, the people of Derinkuyu were doing something profound. They were creating a psychology adequate to their situation. A way of understanding the self that did not depend on movement or achievement or visible progress. A way of being human that could survive in stasis. This is not something we value in the modern world. We celebrate action. We admire people who make things happen. We are uncomfortable with stillness, with waiting, with a passive endurance of situations beyond our control. But the people of Derinkuyu knew something we have forgotten. They knew that sometimes survival is not about doing. It is about not doing. About conserving energy. About making yourself small and quiet and patient. About trusting that the danger will pass if you can just outlast it. This is a different kind of strength than we typically recognize. A strength that has no outward signs. That produces no visible achievements. That might, to an outside observer, look like nothing at all. But it is strength nonetheless. Perhaps the most difficult kind. Because it is easy to be brave for a moment. To take action when action is possible. To fight when there is something to fight against. It is much harder to be brave for months. To remain sane when there is nothing to do. To maintain hope when nothing changes day after day. To trust that your stillness serves a purpose even when you cannot see the results. This is what the people of Derinkuyu had to learn. And in learning it, they changed something fundamental about human consciousness. They discovered that the self is not fixed. That identity is not dependent on external circumstances. That it is possible to be fully human, fully alive, fully present, even in conditions that seem designed to negate all of that. This discovery was not made once. It was made over and over. By every person who descended into those tunnels. By every parent who taught their child to breathe slowly in the dark. By every teacher who told stories of a sun they could not see. By every individual who woke in the darkness and chose, once again, to endure. And each time it was made, it changed the person making it. Rewired their brain. Restructured their consciousness. Made them into something slightly different than they had been before. Over generations, these small changes would have accumulated. The population of Derinkuyu would have evolved, not genetically necessarily, but psychologically. They would have developed a collective wisdom about darkness, cultural knowledge of fear, a shared understanding of how to remain human in the most inhuman conditions. And when they finally emerged, when the danger passed and the stone doors were rolled back and the tunnels were abandoned, they would have carried this knowledge with them. Back to the surface, back into the light. But they would have been changed by it. They would have known things that other people did not know. About darkness, about fear, about the fragility of the world and the resilience of the human mind. And perhaps this knowledge was dangerous. Perhaps it was destabilizing. Because once you understand how quickly everything can collapse, how easily the familiar world can become uninhabitable, how thin the membrane is between survival and annihilation, you can never quite relax into the illusion of safety again. You know the tunnels are there. You know they might be needed again. You know that the darkness is always just a few steps below the surface, waiting. This is the real paradox of Derinkuyu. Not why they built it, but what it cost them to know they had to. Because that knowledge is a burden. It is a weight carried by people who have seen too much, who understand too clearly how precarious existence really is. And yet they survived, not just physically but psychologically. They found ways to remain human, to remain sane, to remain capable of hope and meaning and connection even in the depths of the earth. This is the miracle, not the tunnels themselves, but the fact that the people who used them did not break. Or perhaps they did break in ways we cannot measure. Perhaps the cost of survival was a kind of permanent scarring of the collective psyche, a trauma that echoed through generations, a shadow that never quite went away. We will never know. The people who lived in Derinkuyu left no written records, no descriptions of what it was like, no accounts of how they felt, no testimonies about the psychological cost of living in darkness. All we have are the tunnels themselves, and the marks on the walls, and the strange, precise architecture of spaces designed to keep 20,000 people alive in an environment where every breath is calculated. And somewhere in those tunnels, preserved in stone, is the memory of that moment when someone reached for a lamp and chose not to light it. That moment when fear became discipline, when darkness became safety, when the most human instinct, the desire to see, was subordinated to the more fundamental instinct to survive. This is what Derinkuyu teaches us, if we are willing to learn, that the boundary between human and inhuman is not where we think it is, that consciousness is more flexible, more resilient, more capable of adapting to impossible conditions than we typically assume. But also that this flexibility comes at a cost. That adaptation is not the same as thriving. That survival, while necessary, is not sufficient. Because the people who built Derinkuyu were not just trying to survive. They were trying to preserve something more valuable than mere biological existence. They were trying to preserve culture, memory, identity, the things that make life worth living even when living itself is precarious. And in this effort they succeeded. The tunnels are still there. The ventilation shafts still function. The stone doors still hang on their pivots, ready to seal again if necessary. But the people are gone. The culture that created this place has vanished. The language they spoke is lost. The stories they told in the darkness have been forgotten. And yet something remains. Some echo of their consciousness. Some trace of what they understood about fear and darkness and the resilience of the human mind. Lives in the stone. In the careful precision of the ventilation system. In the communal spaces carved from bedrock. In the alcoves where children sat and learned and imagined a world they could not see. It lives in the silence of those deep chambers. In the darkness that still feels, somehow, inhabited. As if the choice made by that person reaching for the lamp has created a permanent imprint on the space itself. This is not a haunting in any supernatural sense. It is something stranger and more real. It is the persistence of human intentionality in an environment shaped entirely by human fear. Every tunnel, every chamber, every shaft and door and cistern is a fossilized decision, a moment of choice preserved in stone. And walking through these spaces now, even lit by modern electric lights, even crowded with tourists and archaeologists and people taking photographs, you can still feel the weight of those decisions. You can feel the fear that built this place, and the discipline that made it habitable, and the hope that made it bearable. And if you are very quiet, if you turn off your light and stand in one of those deep chambers where the darkness is complete, you can almost hear it. The sound of 20,000 people breathing slowly, conserving air, waiting. For what? We do not know. They did not leave us the answer. They left us only the question, carved in stone, preserved in darkness, echoing through thousands of years. What could terrify ancient humans enough to build something like this? But that is not the real question. The real question is deeper and stranger and more personal. What would terrify you enough to descend into it? To seal the door behind you? To extinguish the lamp and trust the darkness? And more importantly, what would you become down there in the dark, waiting for a danger you cannot see to pass? Would you remain yourself? Or would you transform into something else? Something adapted to the darkness? Something that has learned to see without light? To measure time without change? To find meaning without progress? Something that knows the tunnels are not a prison, but a kind of salvation? A place where the worst of human fear becomes, through extraordinary effort and discipline, a fragile shelter against the end of everything. This is what the people of Derinkuyu became. This is the knowledge they purchased with their fear. And it is still there, waiting in the darkness, for anyone willing to descend far enough to find it. Not an answer exactly, but a question that changes shape the deeper you go. Not a solution, but a kind of companionship with uncertainty. A way of existing that accepts the precariousness of everything without being destroyed by that acceptance. This is the paradox. This is the teaching. This is the gift that Derinkuyu offers across the millennia. Not safety, not certainty, not an escape from fear, but a demonstration that even in the darkest places, even under the most impossible conditions, even when every instinct screams to run toward the light, there is another choice available. The choice to blow out the lamp, to trust the darkness, to become something capable of surviving the unsurvivable. And in that moment of choosing, something shifts. Fear does not disappear. The danger remains real. But the relationship to both changes. You are no longer running from the darkness. You are inhabiting it. You have made it yours. You have transformed it from enemy to ally, from prison to sanctuary. This transformation is not easy. It is not natural. It goes against every evolved instinct in the human brain. But it is possible. Derinkuyu proves it. 18 stories of proof, carved from volcanic rock, preserved for thousands of years. The darkness can be survived. The fear can be metabolized. The impossible can be endured. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But long enough for the danger to pass. Long enough for the world to become habitable again. Long enough for the children born in darkness to emerge into light and remember, or learn for the first time, what the sun looks like. And when they do emerge, when the stone doors are finally rolled back and fresh air floods the tunnels and light penetrates for the first time in months or years, what will they think? Will they feel relief, joy, the simple animal pleasure of warmth on the skin? Or will they feel something more complicated? A strange reluctance to leave the darkness behind. A sense that something important has been lost in the return to light. Because they will have learned things in the darkness that cannot be unlearned. They will have developed capacities that are useless on the surface. They will have become adapted to an environment that no longer exists. And this adaptation, this hard-won knowledge, will become a burden. a weight they carry back into the light, a shadow that follows them even on the brightest days. This is the cost of survival, not death but change, not loss, but transformation into something that can no longer quite fit into the world as it was before. The people of Derinkuyu paid this cost, over and over, generation after generation. Each descent into the tunnels required them to become something other than what they were. Each return to the surface required them to remember how to be human in the way the surface world demanded. And in the space between these two states, between the darkness and the light, between the fear and the relief, they existed in a kind of permanent liminality, never quite belonging to either world, always carrying the memory of one into the experience of the other. This is what trauma does. Splits the self, creates a before and an after that can never quite be reconciled. But it also creates something else, a depth of experience, a knowledge of extremes, an understanding of what human consciousness is capable of when pushed to its limits. And this understanding, while painful, is also valuable, because it reveals something true about the nature of existence that comfort obscures. The world is not safe. It never has been. The appearance of safety is an illusion maintained by favorable circumstances and collective delusion. The people of Derinkuyu knew this. They could not afford the luxury of delusion. They lived too close to the edge. They understood that collapse is always possible, that the familiar world can become uninhabitable without warning, that survival depends on preparation for scenarios we hope will never occur. And so they built the tunnels, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because the alternative was the end of everything they valued. And in building them, they created something that outlasted the specific threats that motivated their construction. They created a monument to human fear, yes, but also to human ingenuity, human resilience, human refusal to accept annihilation quietly. The tunnels are still there. The danger that drove people into them has long since passed. But the knowledge they represent, the hard-won understanding of what survival requires, remains relevant. Because we are still the same species, still vulnerable to the same fears, still capable of the same extraordinary adaptations when circumstances demand them. We have not built tunnels 18 stories deep, most of us, but we have built other kinds of shelters, other ways of protecting ourselves against the dangers we perceive, some physical, some psychological, some technological. And in building these shelters, we make the same calculation that the person in Derinkuyu made when they reached for the lamp. What are we willing to sacrifice for safety? What comforts will we surrender? What parts of our humanity will we transform in order to survive? These are not abstract questions. They are being answered right now by people all over the world. By every person who makes a choice based on fear rather than desire. By every community that builds walls instead of bridges. By every society that chooses security over freedom. The answers vary. The contexts differ. But the fundamental calculation is the same. How much darkness can we endure? What price will we pay to keep the danger at bay? And the lesson of Derinkuyu, if there is one, is this. The price is always higher than you think. The adaptation is always more profound than you anticipate. The transformation is always permanent. You cannot descend into the darkness and emerge unchanged. You cannot build a shelter against fear without becoming, yourself, a kind of shelter. Hard, enclosed, designed to keep things out. This is not a moral judgment. It is simply an observation. a pattern that repeats across scales and contexts and cultures. Fear changes us. Survival transforms us. The darkness we enter to escape danger becomes, over time, a kind of home. And the most disturbing part is this. Eventually, we adapt so completely that we forget why we descended in the first place. The tunnels become normal. The darkness becomes familiar. The stone doors remain sealed not because the danger is still present, but because we have forgotten what the surface world looks like. We become creatures of the dark, not by choice but by habit, not because we prefer it but because we no longer remember the alternative. This is the final paradox of Derinkuyu, the ultimate lesson carved in stone and preserved in darkness. The greatest danger is not the threat that drives you underground. It is the possibility that you will remain there long after the threat has passed. That you will become so adapted to the darkness that you can no longer tolerate the light. That you will seal the stone door not to keep danger out, but to keep yourself in. That you will choose the darkness not because it is safer, but because it is familiar. And in that choice, that slow surrender to fear as a permanent condition rather than a temporary response, something essential is lost. Not life, not even consciousness exactly, but the capacity for wonder, for openness, for the simple animal pleasure of existing in a world that is dangerous, yes, but also beautiful and strange and worth experiencing despite the risk. The people of Derinkuyu did not make this final surrender. We know this because the tunnels were eventually abandoned. The doors were unsealed. The darkness was left behind. They returned to the surface. They chose the light. They accepted the risk of existence in an unsafe world, rather than the certainty of survival in a dark one. This choice was not made once, but many times, by individuals and communities and entire generations. It required courage of a different kind than the courage that carried them underground in the first place. It required the courage to be vulnerable again, to expose themselves to danger, to trust that the world, despite everything, was worth returning to. And in making this choice, they completed the cycle. Descent and return. Darkness and light. Fear and hope. Survival and life. This is the full story of Derinkuyu. Not just the tunnels themselves, but the movement through them. The willingness to enter when necessary. And the wisdom to leave when possible. Both are necessary. Both require strength. But the return is harder. Always. Because it means letting go of the control that darkness offers. The illusion of safety that comes from sealing yourself away from the world. It means accepting that you cannot protect yourself from everything. That danger is real and persistent and will always be there, waiting. And yet, despite this knowledge, despite the fear, despite the memory of what it was like in the darkness, you choose to walk back into the light. You choose to see, be seen, to exist in the dangerous, beautiful, impossible world. And in that moment, when you step out of the tunnel and feel the sun on your face for the first time in months or years, when you see the horizon stretching away in all directions, when you remember what space feels like, what freedom feels like, what life feels like beyond the narrow boundaries of survival, something inside you breaks. Not catastrophically, but cleanly, like ice cracking in the spring. And through that break, something new can emerge. Something that carries the wisdom of the darkness but is not defined by it. Something that knows fear intimately but is not paralyzed by it. Something that has learned to survive the unsurvivable and discovered that survival, while necessary, is not the same as living. This is what the people of Derinkuyu became in the end. Not victims of fear, not prisoners of darkness, but people who had descended into both and found their way back out. Changed, yes, scarred certainly, but also somehow more fully human than they were before. Because they knew what most people never learn. They knew that the self is not fixed, that consciousness can adapt to almost anything, that the boundary between possible and impossible is much more fluid than we assume. They knew that humans are capable of extraordinary things when necessity demands it, but also that these extraordinary capabilities come at a cost. And knowing this, accepting this, carrying this knowledge back into the light, they made a choice that reverberates across the centuries. They chose to remember, to preserve, to build the tunnels not just as shelters but as monuments, as evidence, as testimony to what they had endured and what they had learned. And in doing so, they left us a message, not carved in stone, not spoken in words, but embedded in the very structure of the space itself. The message is simple, almost too simple. It says, this is what fear looks like when it becomes architecture. This is what humans do when survival requires the impossible. This is how far consciousness can bend before it breaks. And beneath that message, implicit but unmistakable, is another. It says, if you are reading this, if you are walking through these tunnels, if you are trying to understand why we built them, then you are standing on the surface. You are in the light. You are safe for now. But the tunnels are still here. The darkness is still waiting. The capacity for descent is still within you. And one day, when the world becomes uninhabitable again, when the familiar collapses and the danger is too great to face in the open, you will remember that these tunnels exist. You will remember that humans before you made this descent and survived it. You will remember that the darkness can be endured. And you will make the same choice they made. The same calculation. The same terrible, necessary decision to trade the light for survival. And when you do, when you stand in that tunnel with your hand on the lamp, deciding whether the flame is worth the air it consumes, you will understand something that cannot be taught, only experienced. You will understand that this moment, this choice, this instant of decision is the entire history of human fear compressed into a single gesture. And whatever you choose, whether you light the lamp or leave it dark, you will be changed by the choosing. You will become someone who knows the weight of that decision, the cost of that calculation. You will become someone who has stood in the darkness and felt the full terror of it, the full weight of the earth above, the full reality of your own fragility. And if you survive, if you endure, if you make it through to the other side, you will emerge into the light carrying that knowledge with you. Not as a burden, though it will feel like one sometimes, but as a gift, a strange, terrible gift. The gift of knowing exactly how much you can endure. The gift of understanding that the darkness is not the end. The gift of remembering that even in the deepest tunnel, even in the most complete darkness, even when every comfort has been stripped away and survival is measured in breaths, you are still human, still conscious, still capable of choice, still able to find meaning in meaninglessness and hope in hopelessness. This is what Derinkuyu teaches. This is its paradox. This is its gift. Not safety, not certainty, not an answer to the question of what ancient humans feared, but a demonstration of what they loved enough to protect, what they valued enough to preserve, what they carried with them into the darkness and refused to let die. Their humanity, their consciousness, their refusal to be erased. And somewhere in the deepest chamber, in the darkest tunnel, in the space where no light has burned for thousands of years, that refusal still echoes. Quiet, patient, waiting for the next person who needs to hear it. The next soul standing in the darkness, wondering if they can endure. The answer is carved in stone, preserved in shadow, held in the silence of spaces designed for survival. The answer is yes, you can endure. The darkness can be survived. The lamp can be extinguished. And you will not disappear. You will transform. You will adapt. You will become something capable of living in impossible conditions. And when the danger passes, when the stone door finally opens, when you step back into the light, you will carry the darkness with you. Not as trauma, though it will be that too, but as knowledge, as evidence, as proof that the human capacity for survival exceeds anything we typically imagine. And in that knowledge, terrible and beautiful in equal measure, is everything Derinkuyu has to teach us. Everything the people who built it learned through experience we can only imagine. Everything that cannot be said in words, only demonstrated through the simple, extraordinary fact of their continued existence. They descended into the darkness. And they returned. Changed, yes, but alive. Still human. Still capable of hope and meaning, and the simple act of carving their names in stone to say, "We were here. We endured. We survived. And if you are reading this, so can you." The tunnels are waiting. The darkness is patient. And the lamp, unlit, sits exactly where they left it, waiting for the moment when someone's hand will reach for it once again, and hesitate, and choose. And in that hesitation lives the entire archaeology of human consciousness. Not the choice itself, but the space before the choice. The moment when the mind calculates possibilities that have no certain outcomes. When fear and reason negotiate in the theater of the prefrontal cortex. When the body knows what it wants, light, always light. But the intellect overrides it with a more fundamental imperative. Stay alive. This override is not natural. It goes against millions of years of evolution that wired us to seek illumination, to fear the dark, to associate visibility with safety. Every ancestor who survived long enough to pass on their genes did so in part because they could see danger coming, because they lit fires, because they pushed back against the night. And yet here, in Derinkuyu, that entire evolutionary inheritance is inverted. The fire becomes the danger. The light becomes the threat. The very thing that kept your ancestors alive for 100,000 generations is now the thing that will kill you if you are not disciplined enough to resist it. This inversion is psychologically devastating. It requires a complete rewiring of threat assessment, a fundamental reorganization of what safety means. And it must happen fast. There is no time for gradual adjustment. When the danger arrives, when the decision is made to descend, when the stone door rolls shut and the lock is set, you have perhaps hours to make this mental shift. From a creature of light to a creature of darkness. From someone who sees to someone who listens. From an individual in space to a body in a collective, breathing the same limited air, surviving only through coordination and trust. Some people would break immediately. The psychological literature on confined spaces tells us this. Not everyone has the temperament for enclosure. Some minds need horizon, need movement, need the possibility of escape. These people would have been identified early, before the crisis, before the descent became necessary. Because communities that survive multi-generational threats develop sophisticated systems for understanding who can endure what. They would have watched their children, noted which ones grew anxious in small spaces, which ones needed constant stimulation, which ones asked too many questions or required too much reassurance. And they would have made calculations that we would find unbearable. Because in a crisis, when the tunnels are the only option, you cannot bring someone who will panic in the dark, someone whose fear will spread like contagion, someone who will use up air screaming for an exit that does not exist. This is not cruelty. This is mathematics. 20,000 people in a sealed environment. Every variable matters. Every weakness becomes a collective liability. So some people were left behind, or went elsewhere, or found other ways to survive. The people who descended into Derinkuyu were selected, consciously or not, for psychological resilience, for the capacity to endure enclosure, for the discipline to remain calm when every instinct screams otherwise. They were, in a sense, the ones most capable of betraying their own biology, most able to override the panic response, most willing to trust the darkness. And this selection pressure, repeated over generations, would have changed the population in subtle ways. Not genetically, necessarily, though there are genes associated with anxiety tolerance and spatial claustrophobia that might have been selected for or against. But culturally, certainly. The knowledge of who could descend and who could not would have been passed down. The traits valued in children would have shifted. The stories told would have emphasized different virtues. Patience over boldness. Stillness over exploration. The capacity to wait over the drive to act. And slowly, over centuries, the people of this region would have developed a culture of endurance. A collective psychology built around the acceptance of periodic descent. A shared understanding that the world above was temporary and the world below was always waiting. This understanding would have shaped everything. Marriage decisions, trade relationships, the location of settlements, the way time itself was conceived. Because if you know that every few years or every generation you will need to descend into darkness for an unknown duration, you organize your entire life around that inevitability. You do not build permanent structures on the surface. Or if you do, you build them in ways that can be abandoned without grief. You do not accumulate possessions that cannot be carried into the tunnels. You do not form attachments to places, only to people. You become, by necessity, psychologically nomadic, even if you never travel more than a few miles from where you were born. Even if the tunnels beneath your feet are the same ones your great-great-grandparents carved. Because descent is a kind of travel. A journey into an interior geography that is always the same and always different. The tunnels do not change, but you do. Each descent transforms you. Each return requires reintegration into a world that has continued without you. And over time, these repeated transformations create a kind of identity that is fluid rather than fixed. A self that can exist in multiple states. Light self and dark self. Surface self and tunnel self. The person you are when you can see and the person you become when vision is impossible. This multiplicity of self is not madness. It is adaptation. It is the psychological equivalent of an amphibian that can breathe both water and air. It is the evolution of consciousness to match the demands of an environment that oscillates between extremes. And it is exhausting. Modern psychology recognizes this exhaustion. We call it code switching when people shift between cultural contexts. We understand it as a form of cognitive load, requiring constant vigilance and self-monitoring. But the people of Derinkuyu were code switching between worlds more different than any cultural divide. Between light and dark. Between space and enclosure. Between autonomy and absolute interdependence. And they had to do it not once, but repeatedly, for their entire lives, with the knowledge that their children would have to do the same. This is a different kind of suffering than we typically acknowledge. Not acute pain but chronic adaptation. Not trauma from a single event, but the accumulated weight of constant readiness for catastrophe. And it leaves marks that are not visible in bone or stone. There is no archaeology of exhaustion. No way to excavate the weariness of a people who spent generations preparing for dangers that might or might not come. No fossil record of the psychological toll of maintaining massive underground infrastructure just in case. But it must have been enormous. Think of the labor required. Not just the initial carving of the tunnels, which itself represents thousands of person-years of work, but the maintenance, the constant clearing of ventilation shafts, the periodic checks of structural integrity, the stockpiling of food and oil and water, the training of each new generation in the disciplines of descent. All of this work done in the shadow of a threat that was unpredictable, that might come next year or not for a generation, that might last weeks or months or years. This is preparation as a way of life. Fear as a cultural foundation. The permanent sacrifice of present resources for future survival. And the psychological cost of this is subtle but profound. Because you cannot live your entire life in preparation for catastrophe without fundamentally altering your relationship to joy, to spontaneity, to the simple pleasure of being alive in the present moment. Every harvest must be rationed with future descent in mind. Every celebration must be measured against the resources it consumes. Every child born is another mouth to feed in the tunnels, another person to train, another variable in the calculus of survival. This does not mean the people of Derinkuyu did not experience happiness. Humans are remarkably adaptable to baseline conditions. We normalize almost anything if we live with it long enough. But it does mean their happiness was different than ours. More contingent, more aware of its own fragility, more shadowed by the knowledge of what might be required at any moment. This is happiness with an asterisk, joy with a footnote, love complicated by the question, when the stone door closes, will you be on the same side as the people you care about? And this question would have haunted every relationship, every friendship, every family bond, because the tunnels could not hold everyone. The calculations were precise. 20,000 people maximum, and that assumes careful rationing and optimal conditions. Any more and the air quality deteriorates. The water runs out faster. The food stores are insufficient. So decisions had to be made. Who descends and who does not? Who is essential to survival and who is expendable? These decisions would not have been random. They would have followed some logic, some system of priority that the community had developed and agreed upon, however reluctantly. The young before the old, perhaps because they represent future fertility. Or the skilled before the unskilled, because certain kinds of knowledge are essential for long-term survival. Or those with family connections before those without, because social cohesion matters in enclosed spaces. Whatever the system, it would have created a hierarchy, a classification of human worth based on utility in crisis. And everyone would have known where they stood in this hierarchy, would have known with varying degrees of certainty whether they would be chosen for descent or left behind. This knowledge would have shaped every social interaction, every political alliance, every marriage and birth and death, because your value to the community was literally your ticket to survival, your claim on a space in the tunnels when the catastrophe came. And maintaining that value required constant performance, constant demonstration of usefulness, constant awareness that you were being evaluated against criteria that might determine whether you lived or died. This is a different kind of society than we typically imagine when we think about ancient communities. Not egalitarian, not based on shared abundance, but organized around scarcity and fear and the brutal logic of triage. And yet, paradoxically, also requiring extraordinary cooperation. Because the tunnels only function if everyone follows the protocols. If the strong protect the weak. If those with more resources share with those who have less. If the collective good is prioritized over individual desire. So you have a social system that is simultaneously hierarchical and communal. That recognizes difference in value but requires equality in sacrifice. That sorts people into categories but depends on the cohesion of the whole. This tension would have been managed somehow. Through ritual perhaps. Through the reinforcement of shared identity. Through the cultivation of trust that transcends individual self-interest. But it would never have been fully resolved. The contradiction is too fundamental. And in the spaces where this tension could not be managed, there would have been conflict, resentment, the slow accumulation of grievances between those who felt entitled to dissent and those who felt unfairly excluded. This conflict would have simmered during the good times, when the tunnels were empty and everyone lived on the surface. But it would have erupted during the bad times, when the danger was approaching and the decisions about who descended had to be made real. Families would have torn apart. Communities would have fractured. Violence would have erupted over access to the stone doors. We have no record of this violence. No archaeological evidence of struggles at the tunnel entrances. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. More likely, the violence was managed through pre-commitment, through the establishment of rules long before the crisis, through the social agreement that when the moment came, everyone would accept their fate without resistance. But such agreements are easy to make in peacetime and hard to honor when your child is being left on the surface and someone else's child is being brought below. The emotional weight of this is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being the person who has to enforce the limit, who has to say no more. The tunnels are full. The doors must be sealed. Imagine looking into the faces of people you have known your entire life. People who helped you harvest, who celebrated with you, who mourned with you, and telling them they cannot enter. Imagine the sound of their voices as the stone door rolls shut. The pleading, cursing, the desperate bargaining. Imagine living with that sound in your memory for the rest of your life. This is the moral cost of Derinkuyu. The price that does not appear in any calculation of tonnage or volume or engineering precision. The price paid in humanity, in compassion, in the ability to look at another person and see them as equally deserving of survival. Because when survival depends on exclusion, when the math of air and water and food requires leaving people behind, something essential changes in how you see other humans. They become variables, problems, threats to the survival of those you have chosen to protect. And this dehumanization, however necessary for survival, is a kind of death. Not physical death, but the death of the moral intuition that all human life has equal value. The people who made these decisions would have carried the weight of them, would have known what they had done, would have understood that they had crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. And when they emerged from the tunnels, when the danger had passed and they returned to the surface, they would have had to face the consequences of their choices. The empty houses, the graves, the absence of people who did not make it through the crisis, whether because they were excluded from the tunnels or because they survived on the surface through some other means and simply never returned. And they would have had to rebuild, not just physically but morally. They would have had to find some way to live with what they had done. to justify it or accept it or simply carry it as a burden they could never put down. This is the hidden history of Derinkuyu, the story that the stones cannot tell, the archaeology of moral compromise and impossible choices, and the slow erosion of ethical certainty under the pressure of survival. And it is this history, more than the tunnels themselves, that speaks most directly to our present moment. Because we are facing, all of us, our own versions of the calculation that the people of Derinkuyu faced. We see the dangers approaching: climate change, resource depletion, political instability, the slow unraveling of systems we depend on. And we are building our own tunnels, our own shelters, our own strategies for survival in a world that is becoming less stable, less predictable, less capable of supporting the number of people currently alive. Some of these tunnels are literal bunkers for the wealthy, underground facilities stocked with food and weapons and air filtration systems. But most are metaphorical: psychological defenses, political walls, economic systems that protect some at the expense of others, social structures that sort people into categories of worthy and unworthy, valuable and expendable. And we tell ourselves that these structures are necessary, that survival requires them, that when the crisis comes, hard decisions will have to be made, and we are simply being realistic about what those decisions will look like. But what we are really doing is rehearsing the moral compromise that the people of Derinkuyu had to make. We are practicing the dehumanization that allows you to roll the stone door shut while people are still outside. We are preparing ourselves, psychologically and socially, for a future in which exclusion is survival and compassion is a luxury we cannot afford. And in doing this preparation, we are becoming something different than we were. Not more evil necessarily, not more cruel, but more accustomed to cruelty, more comfortable with exclusion, more willing to accept as inevitable what would once have seemed unbearable. This is the slow descent, the gradual adaptation to a darker world. And the lesson of Derinkuyu is that this descent is survivable, that humans can adapt to almost anything, that consciousness is flexible enough to accommodate even the most brutal necessities. But the lesson is also this: the adaptation changes you permanently. There is no returning to innocence, no way to unlearn what survival has taught you. The people who emerged from those tunnels were not the same as the people who entered. They carried the darkness with them, the weight of their choices, the knowledge of what they were capable of when pushed to the edge. And that knowledge, passed down through generations, became part of their cultural DNA, part of the legacy they left for us. Not a warning exactly. Warnings assume there is still time to choose differently. But a demonstration, proof of concept, evidence that when the world becomes uninhabitable, when the choice is between descent and death, humans will choose descent. And they will find ways to live in the darkness, to remain human or something like human, even in conditions that seem designed to strip away everything we value about humanity. This is both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it means there is no limit to what we can normalize, no depth to which we cannot descend if we tell ourselves the descent is necessary. Comforting because it means we are more resilient than we think, more capable of endurance, more likely to survive than we fear. But survival is not the same as thriving, and endurance is not the same as living well. The people of Derinkuyu survived. But at what cost? What did they lose in the darkness? What parts of their humanity did they have to surrender in order to adapt? We will never know the full answer. But we can make educated guesses based on what we understand about human psychology and social dynamics and the long-term effects of chronic stress and fear. We can assume they lost some capacity for trust, some ability to believe in the stability of the world, some faith that tomorrow will be like today. We can assume they developed a kind of vigilance that never quite relaxed, a readiness for catastrophe that colored every moment of peace, a sense that the surface world was always temporary, always about to collapse again. We can assume they passed this vigilance to their children, not through explicit teaching necessarily, but through the thousand small ways that parental anxiety shapes childhood development, through tone of voice and body language and the unspoken rules that govern family life. And we can assume that this intergenerational transmission of fear created a population that was, in some fundamental way, oriented toward survival rather than flourishing, toward endurance rather than joy, toward preparation rather than presence. This is the real cost of living under the shadow of Derinkuyu. Not the labor of building it, not the hardship of using it, but the psychological burden of knowing it exists, knowing it might be needed again, knowing that the peace you are experiencing right now is contingent and fragile and could be shattered at any moment. This burden is invisible. It does not show up in skeletal remains or pottery shards. It cannot be excavated or carbon dated or reconstructed through archaeological analysis. But it is real, and it is with us still, because we are the inheritors of Derinkuyu. Not genetically, perhaps. The people who built those tunnels are not our direct ancestors. But psychologically, culturally, we are living in the same paradigm, facing the same questions, making the same calculations about what survival requires and what we are willing to sacrifice to achieve it. And the tunnels we are building, literal and metaphorical, will shape the consciousness of future generations in ways we cannot predict but can certainly imagine. Our children will grow up knowing that the world is not safe, that catastrophe is not impossible, that the comfortable life they are experiencing now might end without warning. And this knowledge will change them, will make them more cautious, more prepared, more willing to make hard choices, but also, perhaps, less capable of the kind of naive optimism that allows for true creativity, true risk-taking, true trust in the future. This is the paradox we are trapped in. The same paradox the people of Derinkuyu faced. Preparation is necessary, but preparation has costs. And at some point, the cost of being ready for catastrophe becomes indistinguishable from the catastrophe itself. You end up living underground even when the surface is safe, keeping the lamp extinguished even when air is abundant, treating every moment of peace as a temporary reprieve rather than as life itself. This is not sustainable, not as a permanent condition, not as a way of existing in the world. At some point you have to take the risk. You have to choose the light. You have to believe, despite all evidence, that the future might be better than the past. The people of Derinkuyu did this. Eventually, the tunnels were abandoned. The doors were left open. The darkness was reclaimed by silence rather than breath. This abandonment is itself a mystery. Why did they stop using the tunnels? Did the threats disappear? Did the community disperse? Did they simply reach a point where the burden of maintenance outweighed the value of readiness? We do not know. The historical record is silent, but the fact of abandonment tells us something important. It tells us that even the most elaborate preparations for catastrophe are temporary, that even the most sophisticated survival strategies eventually outlive their usefulness, that at some point, every generation has to decide whether to continue the work of their ancestors or to let it go and build something new. The people who walked away from Derinkuyu made that decision. They chose to let the darkness stand empty, to leave the lamp where it lay, to trust that whatever came next, they would face it on the surface rather than below. This choice is an act of faith. Not religious faith, but existential faith. The faith that life is worth living even in an unsafe world. That the risk of catastrophe is acceptable if the alternative is permanent preparation for catastrophe. This faith is hard to maintain. It goes against every survival instinct, every lesson learned in the darkness. But it is necessary, because without it, we remain trapped in the tunnels of our own making. Alive, yes, but not fully living. Surviving, but not thriving. The challenge for every generation is to find the balance, to be prepared without being paralyzed, to acknowledge danger without being consumed by fear, to build the tunnels but not move into them permanently. This balance is delicate, and it is different for each person, each community, each moment in history. There is no formula, no algorithm, no way to calculate the correct response to an uncertain future. There is only the choice, made and remade, every day, every hour, every time your hand reaches for the lamp and hesitates. Light it or leave it dark. Descend or remain on the surface. Trust the world or trust the shelter. And in that moment of choosing, you are no different than the person standing in Derinkuyu thousands of years ago, facing the same calculation, weighing the same variables, trying to decide what survival means and what price you are willing to pay for it. They made their choice. They left us the record of it, carved in stone, preserved in darkness. Now the choice is ours. The lamp is waiting. The tunnels are ready. The darkness is patient. And the only question that matters is the same question that has mattered since humans first learned to fear the night. Do we light the flame and trust that there will be enough air? Or do we blow it out and trust that we can survive without seeing? There is no right answer. There never was. There is only the choice itself, and the person you become in the making of it.